I think it's very clear that if he did in life, he definitely had help in doing so, if that is the case. But frankly, I don't think anyone really knows what happened, and I don't want to sit here and be a gatekeeper telling people he's dead, he's not dead. Most people accept he's dead, and so I tend to say that.
The circumstances around Jeffrey Epstein are still being debated and investigated. Did he self-delete? Was he killed? Or is he still alive? The mainstream narrative is that Epstein took care of himself. However, new leaked footage from his cell suggests otherwise. In an interview with Savvy Podcast, investigative journalist Whiney Webb gave her take on what she thinks happened with Epstein's circumstances. Webb suggests that she cannot officially rule out any of the options, but believes either way, Epstein was not alone. Let's listen to what Whitney has to say.
But I'm not gonna dismiss people who say he's still alive, because frankly, nobody knows. And there's been a lot of obfuscation about what went on the night that he was reportedly found dead and all of this. And so, if people want to speculate that, and given, things like the intelligence ties, his ties to powerful people, and things like that, it's certainly possible. But, more often than not, I mean, cases, prominent people like Jeffrey Epstein that threaten, powerful interests with spilling the beans on things. They don't want the beans, they don't want the beans to be public, basically. They can get off in prison even if they're under constant watch. So a good example of this that was in a recent article I did is this Italian man named Michele Sindona. And Michele Sindona went to prison for the collapse of a couple of banks, but it was all tied to this massive scandal involving this Freemasonic lodge in Italy that was called Propaganda 2 or P2, that was basically exposed to contain prominent business leaders, acolytes of Mussolini-style fascism in Italy, top politicians, and all sorts of very powerful figures basically meeting in secret to try and undermine and subvert the government.
Under the weight of a most unusual scandal, the revelation that nearly 1,000 of Italy's elite, including 3 cabinet members, were allegedly members of an outlawed, super-secret, super-evil Masonic lodge called P2.
The mysterious thing called P2, also known as Propaganda 2, D-U-E, was described by Italian magistrates as a state within a state. In addition to the 3 cabinet ministers, its reach extended to 2 undersecretaries, 30 members of parliament, military officers, diplomats, magistrates, professors, and journalists. The problem was not that so many leading members of government belonged to a Masonic lodge, it was that they belonged secretly, and in Italy, secret societies are illegal. What deepened suspicion about the group was the fact that the Grand Master of the lodge was millionaire industrialist Licio Gelli. Mr. Gelli, currently a fugitive, has been implicated in a number of dubious activities, including the fake kidnapping of convicted financier Michael Sindona, who had attempted to avoid trial in New York by fleeing to Europe. It was this investigation which turned up the list of names that brought down the Italian government.
And they also had ties to CIA operations going on at the time, like Operation Gladio, and also had ties to organized crime, specifically the Sicilian Mafia, which Luciano, who I mentioned earlier, the associate of Lansky, was deported in the World War II era, or I think I can't remember the exact year, but around the time of the war, if not immediately after, to Italy, and got involved in that nexus as well. So Michele Sindona could have endangered a lot of powerful people, and he was under 24/7 police watch in this prison, and they were checking his food and all this stuff, and someone put cyanide in his coffee and he died in prison, despite having all of this security to try and keep him from being killed off. He was killed off. So we don't really know, again, what happened to Epstein, but generally in these types of cases, they do tend to get offed if they threaten to spill the beans, and it seemed like Epstein may have been willing to do that. But then again, it depends on how important of an asset he may have been, and I think that remains to be seen. So I'm happy to keep an open mind if new evidence is presented that supports that theory.
The evidence that Webb alludes to is starting to stack up higher and higher, as more information comes out that points to something very different. Not just that Epstein didn't kill himself, but that he may never have died at all. First, let's look at the supposed method of death. Epstein allegedly hanged himself with prison bed sheets. But those sheets are specifically designed not to hold weight. They're thin, tear-resistant fabric that simply isn't strong enough to support a full-grown man. Even stranger, the so-called noose that was shown in photographs wasn't cut at all, despite guards claiming they sliced Epstein down. The fabric was neatly hemmed, completely intact. It looks less like evidence of suicide and more like a planted prop. Then there's the body itself. The photos released of Epstein's corpse don't line up. His facial structure, and especially his ear shape, don't match Epstein's well-documented features. Some researchers even point out the man on the gurney looks far more like Tony Rodham, Hillary Clinton's late brother, than Epstein himself. Combine that with the fact that the photos were taken by a mysterious photographer linked to intelligence circles, and the doubts only grow. And this wasn't the only staged photo op. Just 2 days after Epstein's death, Ghislaine Maxwell was suddenly spotted at an In-N-Out Burger in California, casually reading a book about CIA operatives. The image was passed off as a candid, but it clearly wasn't. There were 2 trays of food, 2 phones, 2 cups, and a mysterious ID lanyard, proof she wasn't alone. Even worse, when the photo metadata was analyzed, it was traced back to a media company tied to Rupert Murdoch, an old Epstein associate. In other words, it was staged for the press. But the most shocking piece of evidence isn't photographic, it's financial. Epstein had quietly set up an offshore account years earlier, which almost no one knew about. At the time of his supposed death, the account held about $700,000. But just days before his death, Epstein signed documents creating a new estate structure. And then, 5 months after his death, a transfer of $15.5 million was sent into that hidden account. Only one man had access. Only one man could have moved that money, Jeffrey Epstein himself. Within weeks, the entire sum was liquidated and vanished. And if that wasn't enough, there's video evidence suggesting Epstein may have resurfaced. Recent drone footage taken over Little St. James, the infamous private island, after his reported death shows a man with Epstein's build and distinctive hair riding an ATV. The moment he notices the drone, he quickly hides his face and speeds into a garage, never to be seen again. When you add it all together, the flimsy bed sheets, the mismatched body photos, the staged Ghislaine sighting, the drone footage, and most importantly, the unexplained $15 million transfer, the case for Epstein still being alive is overwhelming.
But, for reasons I just explained and past precedent about similar cases, I tend to think he died. And I don't think he did it the way the official narrative says, but I would say that he definitely had help if he did himself, and that there's obviously, I think, something about his death that they don't really want to come out. And I think, it would be embarrassing too, in a sense, for the first, for the current administration, because of course it was the first Trump administration when all of this happened. So it was the William Barr-led Department of Justice that technically has responsibility for whatever happened to Epstein in prison.